As the world marks Slavery Remembrance Day, national lockdowns and the inability to travel have increased the risk of exploitation of vulnerable groups. UK-based NGO Minority Rights Group says regulation, prosecutions and punishments of modern slavery have been disrupted or delayed during the pandemic. Many governments have relaxed or suspended labour and social protections to cope with the economic fallout, and that's left workers vulnerable to abuse.
Lower and middle income countries have suffered most. On top of this, these are the places where there are the weakest social protection systems, so there are very few resources or protections for working people to fall back upon.
We find lots of child labor once again entering into the market, girls losing the education, child marriages happening, and women suffering domestic violence at home, and they are burdened with taking care of children, old, sick people in the family, whereas they have lost their own livelihood, which was a great contribution in running the family.
Investigations, prosecutions and punishments of modern slavery, including labour inspections and court proceedings, have been disrupted or delayed in a number of states and territories. These have been caused by remote working prompted by national lockdowns and/or shifting of resources from anti-slavery efforts to fight the pandemic.
Let's speak now to Dr. Katerina Schwartz. She's Assistant Professor in Anti-Slavery Law and Policy and Associate Director of the Rights Lab at the University of Nottingham. Welcome to the program, Doctor. Thank you so much for joining us. Firstly, many people assume that slavery is an historical aberration, something that was a scourge in the past, but it very much is a problem in the present. Can you just tell us how bad the situation is right now?
So it's certainly not a problem that exists only in the past. In fact, slavery has continued throughout history all the way up to today, and there's never been a point in time in human history where we've lived completely without the enslavement of human beings and the exploitation of those human beings. And prior to the pandemic, the best estimates that we had of the scale of slavery globally suggested that there were 40.3 million people living in conditions of modern slavery in the year 2016. And all indications suggest that that may have worsened over the pandemic, that increases in the precariousness of people's conditions and a whole myriad of impacts of pandemic and lockdowns may have in fact worsened that. So while we don't have an updated global figure, we do have a lot of suggestions globally that this problem may have worsened, despite the fact that the world has committed to trying to end the phenomenon by 2030 in the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. So
Yes.
there's certainly a lot of work to do.
And tell us more about how and why the pandemic has worsened modern slavery.
So the pandemic has had a whole variety of impacts around the world and so many different ways that has impacted people's vulnerability to and experiences of modern slavery. And broadly, it's had three impacts. Firstly, it's increased people's vulnerability to being exploited. And that's primarily in two ways. Firstly, people are placed in increasing situations of precarity due to economic hardship, due to job losses, due to the contractions in our economies and due to lockdowns and social restrictions. So they're increasingly vulnerable to being targeted for exploitation. But also at the same time, as we see conditions worsening for many individuals and many families, we also see people reverting to negative coping strategies like child labor, like child marriage, and like exploitation. Then we also see changes in the ways that modern slavery and human trafficking are manifesting. Perpetrators are changing their strategies and their tactics in response to our pandemic reality. So, just like everyone else, perpetrators of modern slavery are adapting to the pandemic context. They're not stopping what they're doing, they're just adapting the ways that they do it. And that poses challenges for those seeking to combat and target modern slavery, trying to respond to that rapidly changing context. And so, the third area in which we're seeing really hard impacts is in responses and efforts to combat modern slavery, as the civil society organizations, the frontline service providers, and the government's efforts to combat modern slavery have, of course, been upset by the pandemic and they've had to adapt. And while many organizations have adapted really rapidly in order to continue serving those most vulnerable people, it's been a significant challenge.
How are businesses and corporations either knowingly or unknowingly complicit in modern slavery?
I think it's important to start by saying no business in today's society can say that they don't know that there's a risk of modern slavery in their supply chains. This problem is so well documented, and the issues for businesses are so well identified now that no business can claim ignorance that there are risks of modern slavery and human exploitation in their supply chains. And during the pandemic, because we've seen such dramatic shifts in demand, in some instances, we've seen massive increases in demand, like in PPE, personal protective equipment, while in others, we've seen massive reductions in demand, like in the garment sector. And in both those contexts, we've created an increased risk of exploitation. On the one hand, because people are facing this pressure to produce more and more with limited labor exploitation oversight and labor inspections. And on the other hand, because all those people working in factories to produce
Mm.
things like garments are often the ones that bear the fallout when orders are cancelled.
Okay, Dr. Katerina Schwartz, we will have to leave it there, but thank you so much for joining us again on Money Talks. We appreciate it.